Mea culpa is a Latin phrase that means through my fault. I don't know Latin, I had to Google that after reading it in an article by the team at 538, where they listed everything they wish they'd covered this year. Articles they wish they'd written, stories they wish they'd spent more time on, and I felt like that was a really nice way of approaching the end of year list format. Now, I've already done my best of list, or at least a slice of my favourite films of 2019, in a video essay series that's been on the channel recently. And I wanted to avoid doing a worst of list because, you know, it's just so negative, and there's been so much negativity, and it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, and it's unfair too to the professionals who worked on those films that I'm sure they really cared about. So instead I'm going to offer you a mea culpa. Now, this is my apology for films that I saw but didn't review, films that I didn't see although I should have done, and films where people clearly wanted a discussion but I wasn't able to put one out in time on the channel. So without further ado, and in no particular order, let's get into talking about films that I should have covered and didn't in 2019. The movie I want to start off with is one of two superhero films on my list, and it's the one that didn't get enough attention, I think, this year. The film is Shazam. A lot's been made in the press recently of DC's attempt to make more individualized films. They tried to do the Marvel type thing where everything is really coherent and very like banter comedy led, and that ultimately led to a bit of a messy film, Justice League, where they'd kind of tried to introduce that stuff halfway through the production process and it just didn't really pan out. So instead it looks like DC's current strategy is to make more kind of niche films, films that reinterpret their work in ways that are, you know, part of but separate from their mainstream DCEU offering. Shazam is part of the DCEU, but it's not really that tightly tied to anything in the plot. You won't hear any mention of Darkseid or Apocalypse, Steppenwolf, anything like that. And the Justice League is sort of like a distant figure in the lives of the children who are its main protagonists. Where Shazam really distances itself from the mainstream DCEU is in being a full-hearted comedy movie. There's none of this banter stuff that is really plaguing the superhero genre at the moment, like you see in Justice League and, let's face it, basically every Marvel film. Instead, it's actually conceived of as a comedy right from the off, and so you get things like comedic set pieces instead of people just bantering ceaselessly. What that amounts to is a pretty subversive look at the superhero genre, which is a good thing because it's starting to feel a little tired, I think, a little rote, taking itself maybe a little too seriously. The actors are mostly children and they are very well cast, they fit their roles very nicely, and the two main adult actors, Zachary Levi and Mark Strong, are both fab in their roles. Strong in particular is having a lot of fun with being a villain, and he manages to tread a kind of careful line between playing it completely for laughs and giving him a believable motivation. He's a scary character and he gets a couple of really terrifying establishing moments, which really lends a bit of weight to the last third of the movie. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't like a deep film. There's nothing serious about the film really, and in fact even in its like final sequence where it's doing the big apocalyptic showdown between the baddie and the goodie, they have one of the best jokes of the film where Mark Strong is kind of monologuing in this storm while flying above a cityscape with Shazam, and the other guy just can't hear him. Like he has no idea what the other guy is saying. It's good fun, and you can read it, I think, as quite a good joke at the expense of Zack Snyder's type of filmmaking as well, where there's lots of shouting in the rain, people's mums' names, for instance, getting shouted in the rain. But in general, what that stuff does is basically skewer the more serious bits of the genre, and it was nice to watch a film that was happy to do that without kind of compromising on a theme that's kind of important to the filmmakers and to the story, which is family and the power of that kind of familial bond. It tells you how bad I think blockbusters have gotten that it just kind of blew me away just for having a structure that worked. It has an opening scene that establishes its villain and the main plot, roughly, that's well put together, and there's a number of like set pieces that are deliberately designed to make viewers kind of experience different emotions, which is such a rare thing now that it's really enjoyable. What really finally won me over to loving Shazam more than just liking it, I think, was how kind-hearted the film is and how positive a view of superheroes and the themes around them that it has. It really reminded me oddly of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, the first and second ones, where there's this kind of like glurginess, this kind of like very sweet sub-element, but it's simultaneously sort of pastiching it and saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if things were like this? That's what I really liked about Shazam, and I was a little disappointed to not see much critical coverage of it, because I think it was a clever, funny, well-positioned film that did something vital for the superhero genre, which I think is in trouble a lot at the moment. But actually critics were more interested in talking about another superhero film, or should I say comic book movie, that came out this year, but I'll get onto that. See, and what I'm doing here is teasing you, right? I'm gonna put the Joker review, which is obviously what I'm talking about, later in the video so that there's more watch time on the video. It's just to be transparent about that. Blame YouTube, sorry. Okay, let's talk about a film I didn't see. While we're talking about stuff that's generally kind-hearted and funny, let's talk about Booksmart. Booksmart is the directorial debut of actor Olivia Wilde, and the easiest way to describe the film is that it's essentially the plot of Superbad, but done in 2019 with a mainly female cast. That in and of itself is actually just a great concept. I love Superbad, and I think Booksmart takes the kind of spirit of that film and has fun with it in a way that's much more female-centric. And I'm glad to see a wider variety of teen movies with female protagonists. They don't all have to be like dying of chemo and then falling in love with the boy who lives next door. It has a really fun cast and a clever, if slightly predictable, script. I found myself at some points thinking, I know what's going to happen in the next scene because it will be whatever is the most woke thing that could happen in this movie. And lo and behold, it does happen. Right up until near the end, where a teacher has sex with a student, and we're supposed to take it as kind of like funny and fun. And yeah, it's not. I don't think that's okay. I missed the film when it first came out. Lots of people recommended it to me and it kept slipping off my schedule for various reasons. And then I managed to catch it recently because it's on streaming in the UK at the moment, especially because of all the chat that's been happening around the Golden Globes and their failure to nominate a single woman director for the Best Director nod, despite plenty of really good films being made by women this year. I noticed Booksmart was coming up in those discussions a lot, so I decided it was time to give it a watch. So I've now seen Booksmart, and I've got to say, I don't actually think it's worthy of Best Director, nor is the film aiming at it. I don't think there's anything about the movie that really wants to be a best film kind of film. It is very happy being this silly teen romp that has a lot of fun with its characters and does weird and interesting stuff, and I think that's all good. It's very, very poppy, it has a huge amount of popular music in it, and I think there's about 7 or 8 times where someone gets into a car, we cut to a back angle of the car as it speeds away and a song starts playing, but you only hear the first couple of bars and then it goes into the conversation that's happening in the car and the music fades down. That's a really specific thing that the film just constantly does. It's fine, but it strikes me as relatively staid ways of making teen movies. Much more successful and interesting are the more imaginative moments of the film. A key scene at a party is communicated through this really clever bit of slow motion filming underwater that then cuts into a long single shot that's done really well, that kind of explores the geography of this party and follows this main character who just found out something kind of sad. Oh, and there's one bit where they turn into dolls, which is insane and really funny. Stuff like that I really enjoyed. I also enjoyed the really observational stuff that I think got a lot of stuff about teendom really right. The problem for me was the kind of friction between those two things and how they rubbed up against each other, which I think didn't often work. So Booksmart is a promising film from a first-time director with a really interesting young cast who've got a bright future ahead of them, fingers crossed, and is also in itself just fun, just a really good fun time. So that's definitely one you should sit down and watch. So from Booksmart to not at all similar, The Current War. The film tells the story of the debate between Westinghouse and Edison over whether or not current, for electricity that is, should be alternating current or direct current. Obviously this is a story where we know who won because we use AC in almost all walks of life now. But at the same time, it's a story that has a huge impact on how electricity develops across America and eventually the rest of the world. There's also an interesting third character in the film who is Nikola Tesla, who was working for Edison originally and then for Westinghouse, and of course eventually had nothing to do with either of them and ended up just having the craziest life that didn't really work out. The film had middling to poor reviews when it came out. It wasn't helped by a long gap between its initial screening at, I think, the Toronto Film Festival and its eventual release. It was the last film owned by the Weinstein Company before the Me Too movement started, and then there was also some issues with it having quite a lukewarm reception at the festival circuit as well. I've got to be honest, I kind of loved the movie while also thinking it was a 3 out of 5 type movie. Some films end up being a 3 out of 5 because they've shot for the middle and they've gotten there. So, bravo for them. And these are these corporate blockbuster type movies that have a very clear aim and are kind of products really to be sold. And some films are a 3 out of 5 because they aim for the stars and they completely fail to arrive. But there's so much interesting and powerful stuff in there that there's some worth to the film. This is more on that end of things. It's really muddled, and you can see quite clearly that Tesla was supposed to be a main character before being kind of cut from the film as much as possible, because his story is much more amorphous and hard to keep track of. In the end, they focus almost entirely on Westinghouse and Edison. Edison is a problem with the film because he's played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who I think is generally a good actor, but has maybe played too many insufferable geniuses at this point, which he plays again here as Edison. The film also has quite an over-the-top visual style, which, appeals to me, but I can understand that it's been quite divisive. I know several people personally who saw the film and really didn't like how it was shot. It was filmed by Chung-Hoon Chung. He's a Korean cinematographer, best known for his collaborations with Park Chan-wook on films like Old Boy and The Handmaiden. He's also working on a film with Edgar Wright at the moment, which I just can't wait for. The camera is really active and has a tendency to fly around scenes, which, combined with a frenetic editing style, makes the film feel incredibly energetic at points. Chung-Hoon Chung clearly has a big box of tricks to play with. There's slow motion, fast motion, long zoomed-in telephoto shots, and macro shots of tiny details and electronics. There are elements that call to mind old films and early photography. There's also like picture within picture stuff like split screen. It's a really bewildering at times mix of things that is somehow, I think, a really clever way of approaching a film that's about inventiveness and about a time where so much was unwritten. There were just rules being made all the time. It's a nice way to embrace that sense of energy and innovation that the characters are experiencing themselves. The film's greatest asset is Michael Shannon as Westinghouse. He's this absolutely phenomenal actor, of course, but this is a fantastic performance from him, and it really plays to his strengths. He's this very reserved man who you feel this scintillating power and energy underneath, this intellectual prowess and kind of conviction of self-belief that is unquestionable. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to bring out at the same time, but he manages it. And it's a much deeper performance, I should say, than Cumberbatch's performance opposite as Edison. There's a lot for me to gush about in this film, and I think some of why I liked it so much is because it felt like it was made for me. It was exactly within my field of interest. And there was also something at the heart of it that I think that films haven't really covered before. It's this central question of what's it like to look around the corner of history, and how easy is it to be wrong? It's no spoiler to say that Edison loses at the end of this because DC isn't picked up. And in the last moments of the film, we see him instead beginning to work on the movie camera. And so there's this fantastic self-reflexive moment where Edison thinks that he's just lost and he may as well just go off and do other stuff. And yet he's invented something so revolutionary that it's actually what was used to film the thing we're watching. Isn't that incredible? That's a really interesting, clever, powerful moment in a film that is often frustratingly uneven. But I don't mind uneven because it sometimes means that people have tried something extraordinary and not quite worked it out. That's fine for me. I'd rather see that than 100 mediocre films. So that's The Current War, which I just gave quite a strong recommendation for without really realizing. I've just convinced myself of how much I liked it. Well, that's good to know. So next up is a film that I actually haven't seen and still haven't seen, so I probably don't have much to say about it, but I am looking forward to seeing it, and I've heard lots of fab stuff about it. This film is Hustlers. I've seen Looking for a Friend at the End of the World, which is directed by the same person, but of course what really drew me to this is its fab cast. Yeah, oh gosh, I actually have nothing to say about the film because I haven't seen it at all. I will say that a lot of people I really respect have talked about this film and said that it was really, really good, so I have to cross my fingers. We'll have to see. Okay, one more and then I'll do Joker. Deal? Good. Ad Astra kind of snuck up on me from nowhere. I felt like I hadn't heard about the film almost until it was out. And then I started seeing these really, really glowing reviews. Of course, it's from a filmmaker who's made plenty of work before, and it's got Brad Pitt in it, so you think it's not going to be terrible. But I didn't really know anything about the movie. And I noticed it really tried to advertise itself as something like Interstellar. That was definitely what came up for me. So I went to go see it in the cinema with my mate Phil. Shout out to Phil. And it's an interesting movie. It's kind of uneven in some ways, in a similar way to The Current War, where it's aimed for something really fantastic and it seems to have somehow came up short. It's helped by being much more contained than The Current War in some ways. Although it goes like literally across our whole solar system, it is fundamentally extremely focused on Brad Pitt's character. And so what you get instead are these little slices of what the world looks like. We have these fab moments on the moon where we see it as this kind of commercialized, capitalized hellscape, like Disneyland on the moon. And then we have Mars, which seems to be like totally devoid of life, incredibly barren, somehow intensely claustrophobic. apparently filled with thousands of people, and yet we never see any of them, just a series of corridors with this light. And I should talk about the light in the film. It starts off quite naturalistic on Earth, and then it gets less and less real. In the lunar landscape, it tends to be quite harsh light from one side, so it's really shadowy, which I think is accurate looking at photos of the moon. But then by the time he reaches Mars, suddenly there's this incredibly strong color cast on the film, and the light is just shifting completely without any natural reason to do so, not least because they're underground as far as I understand it. After that sequence, the film really becomes very abstract, and that's the stuff that actually loses me a little more. I prefer it when it's talking about abstract themes, but through a practical plot that's taking place. And for me, there's kind of like a hard limit on how many dissolves you can have in a single sequence before I think you're being a little self-indulgent. But at the end of the day, this was a cerebral film that I think quite cleverly packaged itself as a more mainstream film. I feel like Ad Astra will be a bit of a gateway drug for people into a slightly more clever type of sci-fi than we often see in the cinemas. And it did get quite a wide release because it had Brad Pitt in it and because it was about space. It got to go out in Odeons and stuff, whereas really it was more arty than that, a lot more art house in its sensibility than anything else. And the music, I should say, is incredibly moving as well. I found that I loved the craft of the film massively, and that I was slightly underwhelmed by the strength of its story, but that the imagery and the kind of ideas and feelings in it were very powerful. So I don't know, I think that's a pretty good take on a movie. I think that sounds okay. Ad Astra is great, and you should see it with a big screen, preferably with a big speaker. And you can also listen to the soundtrack online as well. It's really beautiful, really wonderful. So let's see, I've talked about all those movies. Is there anything I've missed out? Is there any big movie this year that I haven't reviewed? Oh, it's the clown movie. Not the sewer clown movie, the other clown movie, the one with the dancing clown. Joker has had so much press, it's unbelievable. And now it's been nominated for Best Director at the Golden Globes. It will probably get nominated, at least shortlisted, for Best Director at the Oscars, which I find kind of questionable, to be honest with you. So what is Joker? It's a reinterpretation of a very famous comic book character, the clown who fights Batman, but it's also a famous movie character. I mean, he's been in 4 now movies, very high-grossing, large-release American films. And it's also a take, I think, more than anything, on the films of the 1970s that portrayed New York as this kind of hellscape. Movies like Taxi Driver, The King of Comedy is very present in this film, and also Network, I think, as well. It's taking that cinematic language as much as it's taking anything from the comic books and reinterpreting that character in a really brave, I think, way. I've got to say, I think the concept of Joker is fantastic. I think there's lots of strengths in taking very strong, interesting characters and then pulling them into worlds where they really don't look like the characters we know. Because very strong characters you can do that with, and they can change almost entirely and yet retain something about them that's identifiably what you knew. I think about Doctor Who when I think about that, because it's a character that has literally been reinterpreted within its own show, and the show itself is retooled constantly, and yet it retains something. You know, you can never imagine any version of the Doctor seeing someone be downtrodden and not wanting to take their side. DC has a label called Elseworlds. It's kind of gone in and out of print and in and out of fashion. I think they've called it different names over the course of the years. But basically that's the idea behind it. It's taking characters and putting them into places where they look very different to the characters we know and love. In particular, I remember a book called Batman: The Golden Streets of Gotham, which is basically taking Batman and making him a very working class immigrant into America in the 19th century whose parents die in a factory fire, and it sees him as a worker, like a union member when unions were illegal. And so him and Catwoman, who here is this super rich lady called Selina Kyle, whose dad owns factories, donning masks because otherwise they could be put in jail for what they're doing. And it's so different to what Batman sounds like, to what Batman's story is, and yet it felt so identifiably like a Batman story. Now, if you have a character that strong, then why not try and put them in those different situations? And in this case, in Joker's case, you can see the benefits too for the filmmakers in that it's essentially a character study that's mostly like looking at the character's thoughts and feelings in a period setting, And yet they market it as a comic book movie and it makes a huge amount of money, despite not really being a superhero story in any sense. It's not a supervillain story, it doesn't have any superheroes in it. Does that mean that I like the film? No, not really. I didn't really like the film at all. The film's really beautiful and it's very well acted by Joaquin Phoenix, but I found myself turned off by the story, or lack thereof. Phoenix is doing this really strong character study of a guy who we don't know that much about. And every moment where he finds out more about himself, the film veers away from that completely and goes off and does something else. And that's the problem for me with trying to square a character study with a big American movie, because it means you still have to have like big fights on the streets and stuff like that. As for the supposed message of the film, which has gotten a lot of press, I remember seeing someone tweeting like, "This is the most dangerous film of the year," which is like dumb take. But also I've seen reviewers I really like and respect say stuff like, it's a really powerful message about how we can be sane in an insane world. And I disagree with both of those takes fundamentally. I really don't think there's much of a message in Joker. It's mostly this kind of very simple nihilism that's like, everything's bad, so nothing has consequence, which I think is lazy. Sure, Arthur has a terrible life, but the world he lives in is so cartoonishly fucked, it's impossible to take seriously. And it's also incredibly easy for him to do something different. There's so many scenes in the film where he just gets into somewhere he shouldn't be able to get into. There's literally a moment where everyone's protesting or outside this hall where like a gala's taking place. And he just like walks in. He goes down to like a side door and just goes in, which is nuts, just not believable in any sense. And it felt at those moments like the plot was trying to force this character into being instead of the character just existing, and that really threw me out of that story. As for the directing, there's some beautiful visuals in the film. I think the cinematography is really wonderful. I think the production design and the sets and costumes are gorgeous, and all of those things should be definitely nominated for awards. But as far as the directing is concerned, I didn't really think it was great. For me, the director's job is to keep hold of the themes of the film and to tell its story in insightful and interesting ways while also doing so through powerful imagery. And a lot of the imagery in the film, while being beautiful, is also like inexplicably divorced from what's going on. There is so much slow motion dancing in this film that I think if you sped it up to normal speed, you would probably cut 20 minutes from the runtime. And those devices are fine. I just think that there's not much justification for that device being there. Why does Arthur dance? I don't think that's ever really explained. And there's a lot of like lazy little get-outs in the film as well. So like Todd Phillips wants it to be about how people are marginalized, but he does have jokes about little people in there, you know, people with dwarfism. He wanted to be about how Arthur's been marginalised, but there's like almost literally no lines for women in the whole movie, and the one woman who actually exists in the film is in Arthur's head, so, you know, not great. And also, most of what I really like about the film is taken from other people's films. The first third is basically Taxi Driver, the middle is essentially Network, and the last third is basically the king of comedy. So yeah, I love that there are references to other movies in that, and I think it establishes it as a cine-literate film in a way that a lot of the Marvel films aren't, and I hope that that will encourage people to go and watch those films. But I don't think those are his. I don't think that's his stuff to play with. And at the end of the film, when it really should be building up to its climax, and it does maybe its most daring thing, and which I think, by the way, is what people thought was really dangerous in the movie, he just loses it. He loses the thread completely by going back to Batman, by going back to the Waynes in a completely pointless and self-serving way that doesn't really add anything to the story. If anything, drew me out of it further. He also has this kind of like, the Joker becomes the leader of a movement, but why? Like, what is the movement? What has he agitated for? How do people know what he feels or wants? I don't understand. And it just seemed to make very little sense in the context of the film. It reminded me of reading Nietzsche, who's a very famous philosopher. And he's really, really convincing when you're reading him. And then you stop and just wait like a day. And then you sit back and think about it. And it's like, no, wait, none of that stuff made any sense. That was dumb. And I don't agree. And the other similarity between Nietzsche and Todd Phillips, I can't believe this is the point that I'm ending on, is that I don't think either of them really believed a lot of the really outrageous stuff they said. I think Todd Phillips mostly is just trying to be an agent provocateur. He made fun of like woke culture, as he called it. I mean, I think the guy doesn't, you know, has a lot to question himself about in terms of that, but I think he was mostly saying that to get more press, and I think mostly the journalists played into it. What made me sad about Joker was seeing so many negative reviews of it and not seeing many positive reviews of Shazam. I feel like as much as we can talk about what we don't like about things, we should also be saying what we think cinema can be, what we think movies should do. And there were some things in Joker that I think were really good. Now, do I think it's the best movie of the year? Not at all. I don't think it's in the best movies of the year. I don't think it's in the top 10. I didn't like the film. However, I did see a couple of comments on the channel saying like Joker's the best film of the year, maybe the best film of the decade. And to which I say like, cool, that's good. And you're allowed to feel that. However, I would ask you to think about what it is about that film that you really liked. And I would love to have that discussion with you in the comments below here. And one person in particular had said it was the best movie of the decade, which I thought was really interesting. But then I looked at the stats, and in the UK, most adults see about 6 films a year in the cinema. So this year, if you were doing that, you would have seen basically like 2 Marvel films and maybe like a couple of Fox blockbusters like Hobbs and Shaw or something. And then you would have seen Joker. And if that's the case, then yeah, I think that probably was the best film you saw this year. Because Joker, for all of its failings, and I think there are plenty of them, from its way too simplistic, nihilistic message that feels like old hat and sort of like not very meaningful in lots of ways, it's also trying to do something. And I think that's in itself something fantastic in a modern blockbuster that I can't believe I'm saying that. It's just like there's such a dearth of creative intent even behind Marvel's films and Disney's films. I mean, it owns 70% of all films that are being released now, so... Oh, I've depressed myself and I said I wouldn't do a negative review. Boo! Anyway, that's it from me for 2019, but I want to thank you for watching the channel throughout this year, and I hope you're looking forward to 2020 with Indietrix, because I am. There's lots of fantastic films coming out in the new year. Not least of which is award season, but also, hey, let's go and make fun of some blockbusters. That's it from me, but you'll see another video probably like within a week because movies never stop coming out. So have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.